And good day, everybody. This is David Cross again with BT Diamond IP. In today's video, I'm going to start a new series based on the Cloud Automation Appliance, or CAA. And under this series, I'm going to go through a number of videos to demonstrate how the new workflow designer works, how you can graphically drag and drop API endpoints or create your own APIs onto this canvas, and then to demonstrate the different APIs that we have that both interface with IPControl for doing address adds, moves, and deletes, and then also how you can interface with Amazon AWS to synchronize and or work within the APIs to build a IP and subnets and to synchronize the data back into IPControl. So there's a number of different videos that we'll have in this series, and I'm not quite sure how many will be done at this point, but I will say it'd probably be more than two. So we'll go ahead and start with this, and I want to try and keep these shorter and focused on very specific options. So we may go through each flow that we go through in this design and work through each of those as a separate video in order to keep this short enough to give you a quick view of how things are done. So to begin with, the URL that you need to access is the IP address :1880/admin. So HTTPS : your fully qualified name or IP : 1880admin. And this should bring you into a login screen where you'll provide your Inc. admin Node-RED credentials, which you'll need to find from your setup. Now, when you first log in, you're going to be presented with the canvas, which is a web-based application. It uses WebSockets to communicate with a back-end server, which is the Cloud Automation Appliance, and the workflow service. And we'll have a video that will show you stopping and starting the service and working within those. And as you look at this various display, you're going to know, well, go through a couple of things here. On the left-hand side of your display, when you first log in, are the flows and also your different nodes. So what a node is a JavaScript application that's been written on the back end that performs some type of function within the workflow process. So as an example, the input nodes, where you're going to supply input, which might be an inject, or it might be a web service endpoint like we've created here. You're then going to have, basically, you're going to pass that input a payload, which is going to be effectively a JSON string, based on its type of method, which is either post, get, delete, put, and then it's going to pass that through to the next node in the series, who then does something with that particular payload, processes the results, sends its new payload to the response, and so on down the list. So these wires allow us to wire these nodes together to effectively create an API endpoint. Each of these flows has documentation, so if you look at each flow and click on the Info tab, you'll see effectively what the flow description does. So in our examples, we're telling you what the input parameters are, and then as you click on any of these different functions, such as, say, update IPControl, it tells you the input and then also provides you the output information along with other details. So this is effectively the documentation that you use for Node-RED, and will work within Node-RED for the various functions we supply. In terms of all of the nodes themselves, these are, again, as I mentioned, built in, and we're going to use quite a few of these actually as we move through the node demonstration. But the idea is to help you build workflows simply without having to code. So if you're not a JavaScript coder, we could effectively set up a workflow wiring these nodes together and using specific change nodes and switch nodes and other of these defaults to manipulate the JSON data between these node payloads to ensure that we're filling the input node requirements, processing the output node, feeding it into the next node, and so forth. So there's a number of details that we'll go through, and I'll explain on this a little bit more as we walk through it. Now, in terms of the nodes themselves, you typically find that you won't use all of these. However, there are some key nodes that you are going to use. Some of these might be like email. So you'll notice whenever you have a left-hand side, that means that you can have an input passed to this node, and that is typically the last node in the design. And as you drag the nodes onto the canvas and double-click, you'll tend to see properties pages, which help you identify the various parameters of that node to operate. So like with the email, I either have to specify these parameters within the node's configuration itself. By the way, and when you copy these, they clear. Or if I'm wiring this in a sequence, I can tell some of these change nodes to specify things like the to, server, port, and everything within the JSON structure so that when it passes it to the node, I'm programmatically setting those parameters so that the email function could run as an example. And then for our particular nodes, you want to take a look at these and kind of read up on them just to make sure what they are. And then with the IPAM nodes in our version 2 of the CAA, we've included a number of different nodes around the addresses. So you'll see the add child block, the modify blocks, get blocks, exports, and the same thing for IP devices. Where we have any type of AWS interface, you'll see an AWS prefix in the name, such as adding a subnet to AWS for VPCs, describing a subnet, deleting a subnet, describing interfaces, and so forth. And then two special nodes that help us synchronize data between IPControl and AWS, and it determines what the differences are for us before it adds and or deletes to the different service. So we have a number of functionality and nodes that we'll go through in our later videos as we move about. A flow is designed and displayed as a tab. So whatever is in this tab in terms of nodes are part of this flow. A flow doesn't have to be just a single function. It could be a very complex application. It can fill up this entire workspace. Or we can keep it simple using the base function for the tab, naming these accordingly, and then setting up any type of description about the flow that you control. All right, so clicking on these will navigate between the flow. Clicking on the plus sign will add the flows. And what you should see when you design and log into your CAA the first time is basically the login through the sync IPs. These last three are some custom ones that I developed that we'll go through in the video. Now on the right-hand side is where your debugging, your information, and the history of changes are determined so that if you're using just our local Git repository on the CAA for changes, it'll show you which ones are designed and you can restore those back to whatever version they're at. Or you can also add these to a GitHub branch if you want to commit these changes and store it into your local GitHub. So I'm going to do video update. And I already have my GitHub connected, so I'm going to go ahead and push those changes. And then when I go back and look at the history again, I'll be able to see that information and populate those changes. All right, so the commit history, I can see here now that I have one change that's waiting to be pushed, and I'm going to go ahead and push this up to my GitHub moat branch. Now I do need to do this real quick, so 1 second while I change this. Okay, and then once that is synchronized and you have that information set up, you'll then see that your branch and it's synchronized. This will show you the changes. Now, if we refresh that, we would be able to see any changes either made in the GitHub repository or here local. So again, I'm not going to go over too much of this in this video. We will catch up to this in a subsequent video. However, so remember, again, your info is your documentation. Your history shows you the changes and the local changes. Debug is an interesting node that allows you to interact with the specific nodes on the workflows in order to see debug data. So if you're passing information into the nodes, you'll quickly be able to see what that is in a debug. And all you do to enable this is wrap it in or drop it and wire it to whichever node or whose output you wish to see. And you can also modify that you see the complete message object, because there could be other properties or other payloads defined in different properties, or just a payload section, which the next node in the list expects to have in its input to process. So I'll just drop in a message hook here. We'll go ahead and deploy it, and that then makes the change within the flow. And any time that the workflow comes in, they'll pass the parameters. I'll get a login, and this login node is set to send all of its output to a payload, and that will pass it to the message and then also back to the response. And that's how that flow will work. You'll also note here that under the menu system itself, you're going to have a number of different menu options. And the first option is going to allow you to build basically projects which are supported under Node-RED. So a project is going to be effectively a whole new set of JSON flows within a separate project that you can then give its own name. You can specify dependencies if there are any, and then you can switch around between these projects as you see fit. So if you have multiple projects, you can move back and forth between them. Also within the project settings, you're going to find your flow file. So this is the file where all of these flows or tabs are saved in a JSON string structure. And we've also encrypted this so that when you set up your initial flow and your password, if you were to copy this and move it to some other system, you would need that password to introduce it to the system. So you can edit these, and this is also where you would set up your version control for your GitHub and setting up the remote hub. And this is how I have mine defined. If you had, again, any dependencies, which I've added here, and then you can edit your workflow settings at any time. So if you want to set a new one, you can do that. You can also open and switch between flows. One key point about switching between flows or between projects is that you should restart the workflow every time so that it can read the new project file and the new JSON file. Now, a couple other things that we have here, which are really spectacular about Node-RED, and just to show you, when you highlight your nodes, you'll see that they're going to get a kind of a quick highlight around them. If I do the standard Control-C, Control-V, I can copy and paste workflows anywhere within my supported tabs. If I highlight and delete them, they go away. There is no undo in this workflow. So if you're deleting things and move it and you press deploy, your change is made and that deploy is done. So you want to definitely make sure that if you're deleting things that you're sure you want to delete, and then you can also back up or copy or make it backups of the flows if you do that. So to do that, you would highlight your nodes, as I've done here. You would then go ahead and do an export. And when you do an export, you'll select clipboard, and it'll put effectively whatever's in your clipboard into the selected text box. Now, in this list, you can either do compact or formatted. You can do select nodes, you can do the current flow, or you can do all flows, which will give you a backup of all of your flows within this project. So if you're looking to do a backup, you can simply do all flows, copy it offline, save it into a text file, and you can copy and paste that back into the system. So I'm going to do select nodes. We'll export it to the clipboard. And if I ever want to import those or share it with someone else or pass it along, I can then do a import and can paste this information, tell it to import it into a new flow or the current flow, and then place it and select it and then deploy. It's as simple as that. So the great thing about that is if you're working between versions or you're setting up new flows, you can move these around very simply just by copying and pasting, which is a key context, a key concept here for sharing this information. Of your search flows, you can also do a search for anything. So if you're looking for, create subnet, you'll see here that there's a block subnet creation, shows you the node or the tabs. And you can also look at the configuration nodes, and these are effectively nodes that have property screens that allow you then to configure those properties. And you'll see all or unused, and you can show any of the flows, and it'll show that information. And then from the flow, you can add, rename, or delete. Now, a caution here is if you do flow delete, whatever flow you're currently selecting will immediately be deleted. There's no prompting for you to say yes or no. So make sure that's what you want to do. Be very careful of that. However, if you go in and select delete, you'll notice quickly that you can rename it. I could say, video flow example. I can either enable or disable this, and I can also give it a description and say, sample flow as an example. That description then becomes your documentation for that flow. So if you want to give them any kind of markdown details or etc., you can build this documentation system to work in your advantage. And with the flow, if I go in again now and delete it, you'll see it just goes away. I can't recover that unless I go back in and copy and paste that JSON. So be very careful. And when you're complete with this information, you would do deploy to change it and deploy it to the system. Once it's deployed, the workflow activates the changes, and those then can be called through their system. Now, I'm not going to go through subflows right now, but a subflow is basically the way once you've designed your workflows, you can collapse them into a single flow. And within that single flow, you can then have input, output, and you can specify how that um, subflow is. So it could be a collection of multiple nodes, compressed or consolidated to a single function, and then when you drag it onto that canvas, it activates the flow. And so when you look at this, then you'll see that my flow has a login response in this, and I expect that all of this output should then be part of this flow if I call the login node. Okay. You can also change the parameters on this. So if we go down to the node settings, I can change the icon if I want to something else. So if you want to change this subflow, you can do that at your convenience. And lastly, down in here, you're going to have some settings, and within the settings configuration is going to be where you'll have the grid, so what the size of the grid or the canvas that we're working on, to show the status, which we do, so you can see that kind of in real time, and also tips. The keyboard gives you the shortcut capabilities to look at, to not toggle through those. And your GitHub configuration allows you to specify the GitHub and your parameters for your GitHub to publish and post and spawn off new projects. And lastly, when you're done, you log out. You'll see here if there's any changes pending deployment. It'll say they may not be saved if you reload, which we could do, or we could go ahead and deploy them and go from there. Okay, so it looks like we didn't have anything. We'll go ahead and log out and take care from there. And so we're back on the login screen, and that should wrap up our first kind of just introduction to the video. And what I'm going to try to do in the next couple of videos now is walk through the actual nodes, the samples that we give you, and then talk about a specific node or video for AWS. So we'll have the next one, we'll go through the samples. Probably the third one will be the AWS specific and any of the external capabilities from there. So thanks for staying with me through this whole process, and I'll be back again with another video as soon as I can, and hope this helps you navigate your Node-RED Cloud Automation Appliance. Thank you, take care, and thanks for joining. See you in the next video.